Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington, Chapter 8, Phantoms with a Mission, Part 1. Two stories in this episode, Grocer Makes Good and Fire Phantom. So Chapter 8, Phantoms with a Mission. As noted in the introduction to this book, some ghosts are apparently present so they can accomplish specific missions. The following stories in this chapter are Washington-based examples of such project-oriented specters. In our first story, Grocer Makes Good. This ghost story is probably the most heartwarming one I've ever heard. Picture, if you will, a little neighborhood 5 miles northwest of Spokane during the winter of 1931 and 32. The Great Depression had cut a swath through many people's lives, most certainly through the lives of Jacob and Maddie Bell Denton. Try as he might, Jacob could not find a way to support his wife in their hometown. Just days before Thanksgiving, feeling he had no alternative, the man struck out to look for the proverbial greener pastures. Knowing how difficult it was for him to leave, Maddie could not bring herself to tell Jacob that she had just discovered she was pregnant. That knowledge would only have increased his burden. As it was, he was leaving her with no money. He took what little cash they had to help him on his journey. Jacob had, however, arranged for a small line of credit which Maddie could draw on at the local grocery store. The proprietor was a kindly man who had always been good to his customers, including the Dentons. During these terrible times, he assured Jacob that the young man needed not worry about Maddie's well-being while he was gone. The grocer would see to it that the woman had provisions for as long as she needed them, even if that meant exceeding the credit limit that had been established. Agreeing that Jacob would send for Maddie as soon as he found work, the pair parted tearfully. At first, the young wife kept herself busy as she possibly could. She took walks around the neighborhood and cleaned the little 2-room house until it shone. As the pregnancy advanced, she had less and less energy. In a matter of weeks, it was all she could do to drag herself to the corner grocery store every few days. She soon became too weak to make the trip, but by that time, getting there would have done her much good anyway. The line of credit that Jacob had established was already at its maximum. Maddie's pride would not allow her to ask for any additional generosity. Without food, of course, Maddie's energy, stores, and strength waned even more quickly. To make matters worse, the fuel needed to power the heating stove had run out. The woman was not only destitute, but cold and so weak from illness and hunger that she could barely get out of bed by herself. She had no friends or family nearby to call upon, and she had not heard from her beloved Jacob since he said goodbye. Like the terrible economic times around her, Maddie Bell Denton fell into the depths of depression. She spent a solitary, miserable Christmas huddled in bed with the covers clutched over her head. On December 31st, as the clock struck midnight and 1931 became 1932, Maddie was sure she would not live to see the end of the week, much less the end of the new year. On New Year's Day, as she lay in bed under as many covers as she could find, Maddie was certain that she heard a knock at the door, because she was not expecting any visitors. Maddie thought, "It's come to this, then, has it? I'm so sick that I'm hallucinating. Perhaps death is close at hand, and perhaps I am better off for it." Using every ounce of strength in her being, Maddie slowly shuffled to the door of her icy house. She called out, asking who was there, but found that her voice was so weak that it could not possibly have been heard on the other side of the door. Shuddering with the frigid blast of air that blew past her when she pried the door open, Maddie stared out on the front step. There was no one there. Confused, and even colder than she had been before, Maddie was about to close the door when she noticed 3 cartons on her doorstep. Beside them were a pair of 5-gallon cans. "Glory be, Jacob's found a way to get supplies to me," the grateful woman exclaimed. With more determination than strength, Maddie brought the supplies in. Once she had completed the task, she collapsed on the floor in sheer exhaustion. As soon as she was strong enough, Maddie began opening the boxes, giggling like a schoolgirl. Here was everything she would need to get her through the weeks ahead: meat, potatoes, bread, butter, eggs, and canned goods. The 5-gallon containers that she had barely been able to lift were filled to the brim with heating fuel. Nearly giddy with relief, Maddie set about making herself the first meal she had seen in nearly a week. After a few days of nourishment, Maddie found she was able to get up and move around. Every day she silently thanked Jacob for having been so resourceful in getting the food and fuel to her before it was too late. As the first month of the new year wore on, however, there was no word from her husband. She began to worry again. Where was he? Surely he would get word to her soon. What would she do if she ran out of food again? Perhaps Jacob would not ever be able to get back, or even get additional supplies to her. She began to ration her remaining food carefully and to berate herself for having been so greedy when the cartons had first arrived. Despite her determined attempt to stretch what little food and fuel was left, the day eventually came when Maddie Bell Denton's larder was once again bare. Terrified, the woman took to her bed, and she sobbed silently into the pillow. She thought she heard a knock at the door. Straining to listen for the knock to come again, Maddie wiped her eyes and made her way to the door. As she had done all those weeks before, she called out to ask who was there. Again, there was no answer. Peering tentatively through a crack in the door, Maddie decided she must have imagined a knock, for there was no one there. As she prepared to close the door again, the chill air, she again saw what she had seen a month earlier: 3 cardboard cartons and 2 metal containers. Here was another month's supply of groceries. She began to believe she would survive after all. No sooner had she eaten than Maddie fell into a fitful sleep, only to awaken several hours later in terrible pain. Thinking that her stomach was having difficulty digesting the large meal, Maddie tried to make her way to the bathroom. It was then she discovered the reason for her pains. She had miscarried the baby and was no longer pregnant. For several days after the tragedy, she lay in bed, near death herself. Eventually, she felt strong enough to get up and get herself something to eat, and she began to feel confident that she would at least live through this awful ordeal. Some weeks later, Maddie was strong enough to finally venture out of the house. Because she had been cloistered and inactive for so long, even a little bit of exertion was exhausting. The first day, she was only able to walk to the end of the block. The second, she made it a little further along. So it went until eventually she was able to make her way to the neighborhood grocery store. She wanted to go in and say thank you to the owner for having made good on what she presumed was Jacob's request to deliver the food and fuel. When she came to the shop, Mattie pushed against the grocer's heavy glass door. Much to her surprise, she found that it would not open. Thinking that she must be weak from her illness, the woman gave the door an extra push. The resistance was total. The door was locked. Mattie stood back in bewilderment. The grocery store that she'd frequented when she was well, that had kept her alive when she was ill, must have recently gone out of business. The shop windows were papered over. It was evident that the place was vacant. As she stood trying to make sense of what she was seeing, a passerby stopped and asked Mattie if she was all right. "Yes, I'm fine," she replied. "But did the grocer move?" "Don't you know?" the stranger asked. We're having to go all the way to the AMP store in Spokane for groceries now. The grocer died just before the new year. His old place has been locked up all of 1932. Mattie nodded mutely and slowly began to walk home. She needed time to process what had happened over the last 2 months and what she had just learned. If the grocer had died, then who brought those life-saving supplies to her door? After racking her brain for a sensible answer, the woman smiled at the thought that kept popping back into her mind. Perhaps the old grocer's ghost had brought her some supplies from beyond. If nothing else, the silly thought kept her amused while she went through the motions of her empty life. Weeks later, still puzzled as ever by what happened, Mattie answered another knock at the door. This time the arrival was waiting for her on the doorstep, was even more welcome than supplies. There stood Jacob, home at last. Mattie's joy seeing her husband lasted only a moment. The man looked terrible. He was dreadfully thin. His clothes were nearly threadbare, and he had holes in his shoes. Jacob had ridden the rails all the way to California and back, but had not found work. The situation was the same wherever he stopped. Work and even food were in tragically short supply. He had virtually no way to feed himself. He certainly hadn't been able to make arrangements to get food to Mattie. Why? He had only stayed alive on the journey home by nibbling on seeds he found along the way. He still had a handful of the seeds remaining in his pocket. Jacob's relief at being reunited with his wife was so profound that he vowed they would never separate again. After sharing their first meal together in months, the couple made their way into the yard surrounding their house. It was spring now, and the soil outside was rich. They planted the few seeds that Jacob had not eaten on his way back from California. As the weeks wore on, their garden flourished. They were able to trade and barter some of their bumper vegetable crop with a family living in a nearby tent who were raising chickens. The Dentons not only made it through the Depression, but also made lifelong friends with other survivors. Of course, none of them could afford to pay for any sort of entertainment, so they would instead gather in one of their homes and pass the time by telling stories. No matter how many times they heard it, the Dentons' friends never grew tired of hearing how the grocer's ghost had made good on his promise to Jacob by delivering food and fuel to the Dentons' front door for weeks after his own death. And our second and final story for this episode, Fire Phantom. For a time in the late 1800s, the entire community of Goldendale in the extreme south of Washington was haunted by an angry spirit. In 1887, Henry Timmerman had been convicted of a murder that had been committed the year before. Feelings ran so high in this case that authorities kept having to reschedule the man's hanging, worried that the execution would create an angry and dangerous mob. Finally, on April 6, 1888, Timmerman was hanged in Goldendale. Everyone thought Timmerman was guilty. Everyone, that is, except the condemned man in himself. Until the moment the hangman's noose was slipped around his neck, Timmerman vigorously protested his innocence. Seconds before the rope snapped, severing the man's spinal column and ending his life, Henry Timmerman vowed to return. He would come back after death to the town that had wronged him and extract his revenge. Not many months later, all the buildings in the town's downtown core, including the jail where Timmerman had been held and the courthouse where he had been tried and convicted, burned to the ground. Most of the residents of the badly damaged town were sure that the ghost of Henry Timmerman was responsible for the fire. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Ghost Stories of Washington. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, have a great and wonderful day. Bye for now, and we'll see you in the next episode of Ghost Stories of Washington. Thanks for being here. Bye now.